Welcome back to Allison Customs Project Car TV. Where we're at is the truck is leveled out front to back, left to right. We've got about 6 jack stands under it. We're ready to start marking center of the rear axle and on the frame. Get a few more measurements. We'll mark it on the ground as well, and then we're going to start blowing apart the suspension here. Just want all the reference points that we can possibly get before we take that first bolt out. So I will cut to a montage of me taking this thing apart and getting it leveled, and then we will move on to 3-linking and figuring out our coilover shock placement so we can get some parts ordered and get this thing rolling again on its own on coilovers. So stay tuned. Alright, so getting this measurement is actually a pretty easy process. Just going to drop this square down here, and when it's touching the inside of the drum on both sides, I just drew a line again where something is convenient. In this case, it's 8.5 inches on this inside, which makes it 10.5 inches from on the outside here, because it's a 2-inch wide area. And then write it down, 10.5 inches to the inside of the drum. Measured the other side, made a mark where 10.5 inches would be again. And now you have those center lines where you can repeat that measurement as many times as you need to, at least until the tape disappears. So now we can go ahead and, with all these measurements taken, we'll go ahead and get this bump stop out of the way, shock, and the rear shackle mount. Alright guys, I'm going to give you a couple of ways that you can, of course the compressor just kicked on. I'm going to give you a couple ways that you can get rid of these rivets. Now, the way I typically do it is you can use a cutoff wheel Put a bunch of slices in there so that it essentially weakens it. And then I cut off as much as I can. If you're trying to reuse the bracket, you don't really want to go in from the side because it'll dig in, because you can't really get flush with them. So just put a few slices in it and then come back with a flap wheel or a grinder disc and grind them off. And that way works really well. And then when you're ready to actually punch the rivet out, I just use a pointed end punch on my air hammer and hammer that out. Now they also make it looks like a chisel, and you can get in there on a lot of them. They're not hardened, so you can get in there and chisel them off. So we're gonna try a couple different ways here. We'll try the chisel first. I did the other side, I cut it and all that, so we'll try one with a chisel, and then we'll, if it's not working real well, we'll do them with the cutoff wheel. We're gonna spin there so much time. It looks like we need about a 4 3/4 inch spacer to get a 3.5 inch drop. I'm going to check my measurements again and make sure that's about right. We can adjust from there if we want a 3 inch drop or whatever, but alright, well, got everything taken loose, the axle's welded to the frame, and I got a little ahead of myself. I should have welded my standoffs here to the bottom of the frame, and this gives me a 3 inch lowering, so we'll be able to adjust from there with the coilovers. But I didn't take into account my pinion angle yet, so I'm going to have to cut it loose from the axle. I should have just welded those to the frame and left it at that for now. So what I'm going to do next is cut the leaf spring perches off here, and I'll try and save them as much as I can so I can use them to place the axle, but get them cut loose, then re-clamp the axle loosely to the leaf spring so that that helps center. Once I'm done with that, I'll cut these welds loose and then put a jack under the pinion and jack the pinion up, get a couple angle finders on there for the transmission and the pinion on the axle here, and get my pinion angle pretty close. It won't be exact, but it'll be pretty close. And with that done, then I can come back and re-weld this to the axle. So not a big deal, but should have done that first. So anyway, it's the end of the day for today. We'll come back tomorrow morning, get that done, and then start working our links. Hey guys, what's the next day? I got out here this morning and got busy right away. I cut the perches off of the axle. I cut off the old shock mounts just because we don't need them, and then loosely clamped everything back together with the U-bolts and the leaf spring, which put the axle back at the center point where we wanted it. Everything lined up still, and our side to side was still good. And I had still had these things welded up, so all that went pretty smooth. Then as soon as I had all that done, I went ahead and cut the lower part of this orange bar loose from the axle so that I could put a jack under the axle and a jack under the pinion, and basically twisted the pinion until I had what they call equal and opposite. So I've got a downhill slope of only about, with the way the truck is sitting on jack stands right now, the downhill slope on the transmission is only about 1 degree down. So you got an angle, you know, engine's up here, transmission's here. You got 1 degree down. So then you come to the axle, and you want to opposite of that. So you got 1 degree down here. You want 1 degree up on your axle pinion. So got all that set, and that set up my pinion to where I was happy with that. Came back, welded these in. In the perfect world, you had equal and opposite, and you would have your angles less than 3 degrees. Now, we can cheat this when we're done We could always go in and shim the transmission up a little bit. I can't really bring the transmission down more to add more angle on that end. I can only go the other way to change the angle. So you just have to play with it. Most important part is equal and opposite, and then, you know, not having too much angle into the actual U-joint that it causes binding. Which started digging out our link bars. So I think I showed you the long link bar yesterday, but if not, so what we've got, I may not have shown these to you after all. What we've got is some Detroit Speed lower link bars, and the reason we went with these is this end of the link bar has a swivel built into it, and it's tighter than I can do by hand, which is good, but it's made to where if there's any off camber, it's not just being trying to be taken up in the bushing, it's allowing for this to twist just enough. So rather than a bushing or a rod end link or whatever having to take up that bind and or keep it from binding by flexing, the whole head here will flex. These are not cheap. They're about $200 a piece, something like that. So fairly expensive. The only reason we're doing it is because they allow for that flex, and this truck is going to be like 99% street driven. So by allowing for that flex on the street, we get rid of potential for places of noise or binding that would cause unwanted drive, you know, bad driving characteristics, if you will. Now these are the 24-inch bars. I have a couple of these, and then I have some 48-inch bars. And my original thinking was I would be using the 48-inch bars down here, not at their full length, probably something closer to 30 or 36 inches, but they only come in 2 lengths. And that I would put a mount way up here somewhere. Well, as I got to looking, what is probably going to work is just to use the factory leaf spring mount, shortening this bar up by about 2 inches or a little less. So, and then I went over and cut out some tabs on the plasma table. 9/16 inch bolt, that's what the rod ends here are set up for. And my intention, now this rod has not been shortened yet, so it's too long for what we're actually going to do, was to go back something like this, right in the range or realm, whatever, right in the area where the leaf spring would have been. Oh, and while I was making them, this is some I made for somebody else, I just take this edging tool, and it puts a little, or beveling tool, puts a little bevel on the edge, and then I run it through the hole, puts a nice little chamfer on everything. So chamfering tool, beveling tool. And I just set it really short. It's probably not even a 32nd of an inch in a chamfer, but softens the edges a little bit. Anyway, that's just a fabbing idea. So the idea here is that these would be down here. They've got to go forward a little bit as far as rotating so that they're in the right location. The only problem is that limits us on any adjustability. So I think I was going to try and reuse these mounts. And I would just have to make a spacer in here, just turn one on the lathe, a steel spacer to fill the gap. But I think instead what I'm going to do is go ahead and cut these off, move this mount forward by roughly 1.5 inches, 2 inches. Basically, I'm just going to use the full length of the existing bar instead of shortening it. And more importantly, what I'm going to do is put 3 holes in the mount, and I'm going to set it all up with the center mount hole, but then have one where I can go up or down so we can adjust the suspension, kind of tune the suspension if we need to, versus having 0 adjustability built in. Now, I don't think we're really going to need a whole lot, but I would like to have it in there, have that available to us. So my next thing is, rather than shortening this bar and welding those tabs on, I'm going to go ahead and cut this one loose. Same deal as yesterday, cut the rivets, grind them flush, drive them out with the air hammer, and then we'll make a new mount that moves forward, like I said, about 1.5 inches, whatever it is here, to get to center, and gives us 3 bolt holes for locating the front. And then on the center link, because this is going to be a 3-link, so on the center link, I'll have to make some kind of apparatus that goes over the top of the differential housing, because it's cast iron. It's not easy to get a good weld on cast iron, so it's really not even worth it. We'll just build a bridge that comes from the axle tubes goes up at an angle and then flattens out right over the top of the axle housing, or the differential housing rather, and we'll keep it as tight to all of that as we can. Make it out of probably 1/4 inch. It'll be more than strong enough to control the pinion. And then we're going to use one of the long link bars to come up forward. So right up here you can see there's a cross member, and this is a piece of channel. It's a little heavier than 16 gauge, but it's probably not 14 gauge. I'm sure it's a metric or something. Anyway, it is just a little narrower than 3 inches and a little bit taller than 1 inch. But I think what I've come up with the idea to do is this is bolted on, supports the fuel tank on that side and just the heat shield on this side for the muffler. I'm going to remake this out of 1x3 125 wall tubing, rectangular tubing. I'll cut this to get the same arches, you know. We'll try and make it look very similar to this. But when it comes over to the center, then we'll add a leg that comes back to this other brace, and we'll make it to where that leg bolts onto this brace, so that, because this one is bolt on. With those all tied together, we should have plenty of rigidity, and then we'll make some tabs that hang down and catch the front of our center control arm, our pinion control arm, if you will, the upper control arm, and we'll get the center points, the bolt points lined up, and the same on the back. We'll line up the bolt points so that they are essentially 3 parallel links that are all on the same pivots, so that as this thing moves up and down, it moves on an arc, but we won't be getting a pinion angle change as we cycle through the suspension. So it's not a huge problem on street-driven vehicles to get a little bit of pinion angle change. You're not going to get so much that it's going to cause the U-joint to bind unless you were already in a near bind at ride height. So you need to make sure of that. But you know, if you were doing a rock crawler or some other four-wheel drive that's got 12, 14, 18 inches of travel in your suspension, you can get a big pinion change if things aren't lined up well. In this case, not really going to be a problem, but the more I can take that out of the equation, the better it'll be, especially for tuning the suspension to how the truck reacts in a hard corner situation like on an autocross track. So we're going to have link center here, link center here, link center, link center. They'll all be right at the 24 inch, maybe 25 inch length. Let's see what these are right now. They're roughly 24 1/4. So that's basically what we're going to aim for all 3 of them. The upper bars and the lower bars, all of them, only one end is fixed. The other end is just a sleeve slid in there with a couple tack welds on it. Cut the tack welds loose, we'll drill a hole through the tubing so we can do a rosette weld, and we'll cut them the length that we want. But we've got 2 of the short ones, we've got a long one. We actually have 2 short ones, 2 long ones. We're good no matter how we want to do it. So that's my plan. That's the kind of the game plan for it. I already cut out the tabs for the axles, as you can see. I got to drill the holes in the other side, and then we're going to go ahead and do these front mounts and set these up.